Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Science North Bluecoat Talks. I am Nina Nesseth. I'm a staff scientist at Science North, and I'm here today with Dr. Erin Langille. And Erin is a professor of computer science and video game design at Laurentian University. And Erin, did I miss anything? I know that you have a quite broad and varied background when it comes to uh, games and game design and development. Did you want to share a little bit of your journey?
Oh, my journey through video game design, boy, that would start probably in the early 80s when I was a little bit younger than I am now and was staying inside every recess to play on a Commodore 64 and exploring text games through a VIC-20s and, all of those starter computers that kind of paved the way for video games through to my first Nintendo Entertainment System when I was about 13 or 14. And then fast forward to doing a degree in computer science in the mid 90s, and then coming back to computer science after a little bit in industry and realizing that there was a way to get involved with video games again, not only as a professor but also as a hobbyist game designer and columnist and occasional book chapter writer and things like that. So it's a long story, but I guess the short version is that video game playing brought me to video game science and video game teaching.
That's awesome. So we're going to be chatting about video games and game design today. If you have any questions, those who are watching today, feel free to add your questions in the chat below and we'll be able to ask them to Erin directly. And thank you again, Erin, for joining us. So one thing, just to start us off, that I've noticed, especially since we've been at home, a lot of us, as part of quarantine, as part of current events, that there's been a lot more conversation around video games. I've seen a lot more conversation online, especially personally in my feeds. I see a lot of conversation about Animal Crossing New Horizons, and and a lot of people sort of like engaging through games. What are your views, or can you speak to the role of video games, and what that role might be playing in people's lives right now?
Yeah, so I think that for the most part, video games is playing the same role it normally does. It gives us a chance to kind of be somewhere else. It takes us away from the news for a little while. It gives us a little escape. And I mean, Animal Crossing is a perfect example of that. In Animal Crossing, you get to wander around and catch fish and plant flowers and sculpt your island. And there's really no conflict. Occasionally, you get a grumpy neighbor who may or may not want to stay on the island. In the worst case, they go to another island, and in the best case, they stick around. But there's no real conflict. It's just kind of you and building this sort of ideal existence on this little tiny screen on this little tiny island. Um, so I don't think that kind of escapism is all that different now in terms of what it's doing for us. It's just more heightened and more needed, I think, than it is, you know, if you kind of rewind to February or January. Um, I think before we were quarantining and self-isolating, I just think that now it's just it's more valuable to us than it was before, and we kind of see the value a little bit more, and we talk about the value a little bit more, even though it was kind of playing the same role previously. And some colleagues and I actually talked about what value video games bring during a pandemic, and it is that kind of escapism, not in a dramatic way, not in a necessarily harmful way, but just in a way that gives you a little bit of rest, between things that are happening in the world, pandemics, global political issues. There's so much happening right now that occasionally it's nice to just give ourselves a break. And I think more now than maybe previously, people are also turning to video games and turning away from social media. Like, I know that social media is still very important to a lot of people, but you see a lot more people saying, I'm going to shut down my Twitter for a little while. I'm going to shut down Facebook and Instagram. But not a lot of people are saying, I'm going to shut down my video games, because I think that's where they're going when they shut other things down. So I do think that they have a very important role to play right now. Um, Not that different from what it was previously, just more heightened, I think.
It's funny that you mentioned that Animal Crossing does have that sort of very pleasant, idyllic kind of environment to it. I did jump onto the Animal Crossing bandwagon myself, and on my first day playing, one of my islanders actually told me that my outfit was terrible. And thus I started my campaign to get that negative islander off my island, because we don't need that negativity.
Yeah.
Um,
But the nice part about Animal Crossing is that's about as bad as it gets. It's actually very calm, very soothing, and people have a lot of control over what happens, more than there is a lack of control. So it's really a beautiful game to kind of have that sort of release. And I mean, there are other games too. I certainly I don't want to pretend that Animal Crossing has just sort of taken over the gaming world. The Last of Us 2 was released last week. And my social media feeds are full of reviews and stories and people saying how emotional it was and how valuable it was. I'm playing a bunch of old games right now that I have a little bit of extra time on my hands. I'm playing some older games that I didn't get to previously, and I'm sort of exploring them in preparation for a game design class, which will come again in the fall, because I like to be able to talk about some of those things. And it's just a nice way to kind of turn some of the other stuff off for now. And then you go back to it and start dealing with the things that are happening around us again. But it's just that little break that you need to kind of reset um, the insides a little bit.
looks like we've received a question on Facebook, and the question is, Aaron, in your opinion, what makes a game successful?
Oh, so that's a question that we do kind of talk about in our Game Design 1 and Game Design 2 classes at Laurentian, because it really depends. Like, I think a lot of students come into a program like game design or computer science looking to have a good career, which is totally fair, and then looking to have that big hit, that one game where you spend 2 or 3 years kind of in solitude, hammering out the next big indie title, and all of a sudden you find yourself to be a minor millionaire or something like that. Um, but success in a video game can really mean different things depending on who you talk to. And independent developers are actually really good at talking about these kinds of things, more so than, say, a big studio like EA or any of the Naughty Dog studios, like any of the big ones. They're likely going to say, the success of a game is overcoming the advertising budget and the development budget and being able to have a good return for our shareholders. That's fair for a studio that big. For some people in small studios, small little groups of 1, 2, 3 people, success for a video game may be getting to 1,000 downloads and 1,000 players. It could be simply finishing it. Like, there are games that I will follow a lot of independent developers on social media like Twitter, and they're not really thinking about financial gain. They're just glad that it's done, and a lot of times it's because they have a story to tell. There's a lot of smaller video games that won't make any money or lots of money. Um, and what's valuable to the developers, what's successful about the game, is if a couple of people email them back and say, that's my story too. I'm really glad that you told it. And I'm really glad that I was able to engage with it in a way that's different from a book or a short film. If you get the opportunity to play the protagonist and work through a story about depression or work through a story about loss, like, that can be really meaningful. And of course, if you're depending on this for a living, making a few bucks doesn't hurt while you're at it. But when I get the question, what makes a video game successful? you really have to ask the original developers, because there can be a lot of things upon which you say, this video game mattered and was successful because I managed to accomplish this thing, whether that's financial or emotional or connection. You really kind of have to go back to the developers. Now, if you want to sort of dive in and say, how do you make a financially successful video game? That kind of boils down to making a story that is that connects with enough people that are willing to pay to play that story or that experience, that you sort of overcome that development budget deficit and start making some money. And there are lots of considerations when you're doing stuff like that. If you're an independent developer, the biggest one is probably marketing and reach, making sure that you have enough people that are excited about the game that when you release it, they immediately go and download it, or they pre-order it on Steam or whatever platform you're using. Marketing is a really, really big deal for most games. And a lot of games that fail, it's because it gets entirely developed and then they say, now here's my game, and there's just not enough initial momentum to kind of carry it through. You got to build that hype usually. So there's two sides to that question, and that's a big one. That's a 3-hour lecture right there.
Oh, I bet. To our earlier discussion about games being part of people's lives, we have a comment from Max that says, the Civilization games have had a huge uptick in my circles for sure, and I do find myself leaning in on more casual games during this whole thing. Although it's interesting because you mentioned The Last of Us 2, which was just released and has been kind of having its time in the light on social media, especially. And that's a very, very different, I would say, from like a more casual game, and very different from something like Civ or Animal Crossing in that it's extremely emotional. I wonder if there's some sort of catharsis to that.
Oh, for sure. And the thing about The Last of Us 2 is that it's riding the hype wave from the original The Last of Us, which was an absolutely phenomenal success, both financially and in terms of games that really connected with people. There was a real emotional pull to that game, and we talk a lot about. Um, it's funny when you ask a room full of computer science students, how many of you have cried at a video game. And it tends to, it's pretty close to the number of people that have cried at a TV show or a movie. And in some cases, it can even run a little bit higher. People get invested in the characters. And the key to that is you are the character, you're playing the characters, you're making the decisions on their behalf. So, it's a very different emotional investment than sitting and watching a movie, where you might say that character reminds me of me, or this storyline reminds me of something I've been through. But when you play a video game, especially one that's got a high level of engagement, like a first person game, you tend to be more emotionally invested in that character's survival and their success. In terms of switching to more casual games, I totally agree. And I think a lot of that is because we are spending a little bit more time on our phones, so they're handy. And we are invested in different things with so much happening in the world right now. We don't necessarily want to disconnect for 2 or 3 hours to sit down and have a session of a really long story-driven game. We might just want to pick up our phone or our tablet, or even just a casual game that you can fire up, play around in 5 or 6, maybe 10 minutes, and then shut down and go back to work, go back to whatever it is in real life that needs to be dealt with. So I think we're seeing an uptick in both, those kind of escapism, longer session games, and casual games as well. In fact, I think the game industry is doing. I don't want to make it seem like the game industry was the cause of the pandemic. I just think that they're doing really well because of it, because it's such a natural place for us to turn when we need our spirits lifted and we need sort of that, that emotional escapism. So I think games is actually doing quite well as an industry at the moment because of those features.
You've mentioned a few times already the value of being able to see yourself in the game that you're playing, especially if it's a more narrative-based game. Um, you've also been vocal in the past about games as tools, potential tools for social change. Um, what what do you see right now in the like in terms of where games are headed? If there's a future as for games to act as these sorts of tools, or like if you don't see that in your projections, what would you hope to see?
No, I do see it. I really do see it. And maybe it's the angle that I come from. Like maybe I see it more naturally because I'm looking for it. So maybe I see it more than the average gamer because I'm kind of at this point trained to look for those kinds of things. We do a lot of talking in our classes about particularly representation and like you're saying, seeing yourself in the games. And this is something that the games industry has struggled with for a really long time. Protagonists were always kind of cut from the same mold, and people started to become a lot more vocal about it, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. No, unfortunately, the game industry is rather large and kind of entrenched in some not so great ways of doing things. There's no question. Um, but players in particular have become vocal enough to say, I do not see myself in this game, and I will not continue to play games where I don't see myself. So you see a lot of customization options now where you can customize your avatar in any number of ways. And then you get to sit back and say, cool, that character is now like me. I can identify with that character. And for a lot of players, this is the first time they're seeing those kinds of things. So we're seeing this really cool effect of players being far more connected to avatars and characters than they were before, especially people that didn't see themselves in video games or only saw themselves in negative characters, for example. Like that's really damaging over the short term and over the long term. So the industry is kind of starting to shift away from that. You see that in a lot of games like Overwatch that has a really diverse, or I should actually be a little bit more careful, a more diverse array of characters than what we've seen in the past. And a lot of other studios are starting to follow suit. Um, the next Spider-Man game that's going to come out and be featured for the PlayStation 5, the follow-up to the previous Spider-Man, which was a huge success, features Miles Morales, which is a really big step, and people are just cheering all through my Twitter feed, like that's the character they wanted to play, and so that's a really big deal. And I think where some of this started, certainly not all of it, was that independent video games said, "Look, we are not tied to a board of directors. We're not tied to shareholders. We can actually do whatever we want. Our characters can look however they want. Our characters can behave however we want." And so games like Towerfall Ascension, which is an independent game that I highly recommend people pick up, is a great party game. You can play up to 8 players, and it's kind of frantic, and it's a really good time. And I play it with my students every year. And if I ask my students if we have a quiet day and I say, what game do you want to play? They almost always say they want to play Towerfall. And what's interesting about Towerfall is it has one of the most diverse array of playable characters. There are characters of all different skin tones, pixelated skin tones. There are characters of all different sort of backstories. There are non-binary characters. And there was no there was nobody pushing them to do that other than the developers themselves, who said, actually, we want to do something different. We want to make a game that appeals to everyone, a game where everybody feels comfortable playing and sees themselves in these little like half a minute sessions of frantic arrow tossing and stuff like that. And so when you look at the independent developers that say, actually, we're just going to do things the way we want to. I interviewed a developer for a book chapter that I wrote a couple of years ago who's writing a role-playing game called Eichenfell. And he, when you look at the poster for Eichenfeld, there's the characters are very diverse and very interesting. And so I sent him a private message over Twitter, and I said, can I ask you a couple of questions? And basically it was along the lines of, why do that? Why is that interesting? Why did you want to make your characters so diverse and interesting? And he replied with almost no hesitation saying, I wanted to write the game that reflects the world I want to see. And so those kinds of things, when everybody can see themselves as a hero, as a protagonist, um, then the world starts to pay a little bit more attention and say, and then the bigger studios are like, oh, it was really successful and they had a diverse array of characters. Maybe we can do that too. And then the excuses start to melt away of why they're not doing that anymore. Like, if this little 3 or 4 person team can do it, why can't a big studio? And so change starts to happen. And video games have such an amazing reach. Like, the video game industry rivals the film industry, and the film industry has been around for 100 years. Video games in their current form are about 40 years old, but there are so many video game players that, pushing this kind of social change matters. And it's something that can be done, should be done, and slowly but surely at all levels is starting to be done. It's late, but it's nice to see it starting to happen.
Absolutely. We have another question that has come into us, and the question is, Aaron, how do you feel about the crunch culture surrounding a lot of these newer games coming out? And how do you think it's affected people having to work from home instead of from a studio environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Crunch culture is almost never a good thing. In any industry, really. If you are not working in an industry, well, I guess the example is, I guess we appreciate people that are working crunch on a vaccine, for example, for COVID-19. But there are very few industries where crunch is a reasonable way of doing things. And just in case people are like, what does that mean, crunch? This is usually, most video games will enter a phase towards the end of development, usually towards the end of development, but it can happen earlier, where developers and designers are asked to work extraordinarily long hours, like 60 to 80 hours every week. It's the kind of thing where they'll write about barely sleeping, and they just basically develop all the time in order to meet usually a predetermined release date. So for example, if a big studio is to say, we're going to release our game on August the 31st, and they find out that on July the 1st they're not ready, they will ask employees to work these really, really long hours. My take on is that it's almost always bad. There's very little good that comes out of crunch time other than meeting a deadline. So the only real positive is that for big studios in particular, shareholder expectations are met on the release date. Usually it can have a negative impact on the quality of the game. So this is how you end up with games that you're paying $85 to play and servers that don't work because there wasn't enough time to put in on the infrastructure. This is how you end up with patches that need to be done after 48 hours. And it's not because the developers aren't trying, it's just they're being pushed too hard. And then you get the toll on the people themselves, though. So like, putting the economic and the game quality issues aside, you get the toll on the people that are doing this. This is extremely hard on anybody that has a family. And even for individuals, that kind of time is very, very draining. And there's a lot of burnout in the industry that is almost 100% attributable to crunch culture. So to answer the question, I think it's bad. I think it's never necessary. And I shouldn't say a lot of studios, some studios, Blizzard does this in particular, which is really frustrating for players. If Blizzard announces a game and you go to their website to see when it's going to be released, all they ever say is when it's ready. They say it will be released when it's ready. You won't get any sort of deadline at all. You'll just get it's done when it's done. So that, I think, is a much healthier way of looking at things. And I don't think crunch culture should ever be um, encouraged in
Yeah,
any way.
I agree that it should never be encouraged, and I'm sure you'd agree that given current events where more people are working with sort of, we'll say, squishier days because some of us are at home all the time and time doesn't seem to follow the same patterns as we'd be used to. We were not structuring our time the same way. It's adding additional stresses. We actually also got a comment that agrees with you from Jen Tremblay, which says, creative juices can't flow when you're in survival mode.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think there was actually another part of your question that I'm just remembering now, like how is the pandemic affecting developers? So I think more than anything, because these people work largely in a digital realm, I think a lot of game design, especially smaller studios, it's pretty much business as usual. For larger studios, it's a little bit more problematic because they might not be able to get into the studio to do voice acting. They might not be able to do motion capture. So those kinds of things might be holding up release dates. And we are seeing a lot of release dates being pushed. Cyberpunk 2077 is being pushed to later on this year, a highly anticipated game that I think has Keanu Reeves in it, which is, reason enough to go buy it. But, a lot of the studios are saying we just can't meet the deadlines. And I'm not sure it's so much because the coders can't work and the artists can't work. I think it's other factors that are keeping them from maybe being able to do playtesting, because a lot of the big titles will do numerous rounds of playtesting. But the good part is, in the interest of keeping people healthy and safe, they are starting to push some of the deadlines. So that's a good sign. But I think a lot of the other places are probably pretty much business as usual if they're not being stuck by some of those things that have to be done in person.
That makes a lot of sense. Just veering away really, really briefly from game design. Erin, can you share what the print is on your shirt? Someone has guessed that it is jellyfish.
I have no idea. What? I don't know. I
The
can't
pattern?
see. Oh,
No,
no, no, no. Oh, the design.
yeah.
I thought there was words on it somewhere. It is ice cream cones, because Sudbury is sitting at a rather toasty 30-ish degrees. So I figured I'd try to cool things down a little bit with the t-shirt at least. Yeah, it is ice cream cones. I should have worn something a little more game designy, but ice cream cones it is.
I think it's a great fit for summer. We've been talking a lot about games as a means for uh, escapism, and you touched on this a little bit, but uh, entertainment and human connection aside, there are also concerns that people have of spending, just too many hours staring at a screen, especially since some of us are, doing more work in Zoom meetings, more work on screens, trying to keep on top of current events on our social media. So, do you have any recommendations for people who may feel like they're spending too much time staring at their screens, or if they have kids and they're concerned that their kids may be spending too much time staring at a screen?
For sure. Yeah. So there's two big categories. There's the adults and there's the kids. For adults, if you're at the point where you're saying to yourself, "Am I spending too much time doing this?" The answer is probably yes. And that, for the most part, that'll fall onto most of us to self-regulate and take a break. Um, if I'm no matter where you are, there's probably beautiful places to walk, get out in the sunshine. If it's too warm, just go out for a little bit. Uh, Try to, it's kind of just a switch into kind of that life coach sort of mode. Make sure that your hobbies are varied and that you have a lot of different things to do, particularly if you are staring at a screen all the time. I tend to only play 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and then I'll put it down and go back to whatever it was I was doing. That's not to say I wouldn't enjoy taking a weekend off and throwing 20 hours into something, but it's just a matter of maintaining that balance. And unfortunately for adults, that usually falls on our own shoulders to self-regulate, unless you have a partner that's kind enough to say, "Why don't you stop playing that thing for a little while?" which can be helpful to, particularly listening to them if they can see that you're developing unhealthy patterns. And really what you're looking for is, are you doing the work that needs to be done? Are you eating properly? Are you exercising as much as you would have normally, or are you putting all of your time into games? And if you're putting all of your time into games, then it's probably worth taking a step back and kind of reevaluating how to break that cycle. For kids, it's a weird time to have a school-aged kid because they just spent the last 2.5 months schooling online, which is really unusual for a lot of us that have kids that go to school for the day. So they've been doing classes online and they've been doing homework online. My advice almost universally to parents is play games with your kids, and try to avoid as much as possible. It really depends on how old your kids are. Like 18 is very different from 6, for example. But try to avoid the kind of, well, just go play this game and, I have to work right now. And then 6 hours later, you realize they're still doing that same activity, that same game. As much as possible, try to play with them. It gives you the opportunity to talk about the things that are happening in the games, and it also gives you the opportunity to kind of monitor their time spent in real time. And I know that this is challenging. I'm a little bit worried about a flood of comments from people that are like, I'm working from home, everything's different now. I totally understand. We in this house, we've been dealing with exactly the same thing. And everybody's trying to find out what that normal is going to be now that the summer has started for school age kids as well, that have kind of had this weird 2.5 months of pseudo summer already, and with not a lot of activities. So the short version, I guess, the short version that I've made rather long, is to kind of pay attention as much as you can so that you're aware of how much your kids are playing. And then vary their hobbies a little bit as well. Take out the crafting books, bake a cake, go for a walk, do those kinds of things. So same kind of advice, but a little bit more monitoring from the kid side of things.
We have some viewer questions, but I just have a quick follow-up before I get to them. As an adult, I find it's really easy to have the intention to only spend 20 or 30 minutes playing a game. And then suddenly I look at my phone and 6 hours have somehow passed.
Mm-hmm.
What tools do you use to kind of keep track of those sessions? Do you use a timer or an alarm?
So certainly you could, absolutely, because that's the kind of thing I would do for my kids as well. I would say, you've got 45 minutes. When the alarm goes off, you're done. And usually there's a little bit of complaining, like I need to find a save point or whatever, and that's fine. You can give them a 5-minute buffer. For myself, recently, what I've been doing, I'm playing a particular game that has main quests and side quests. So any gamers out there that have played some bigger games will know those terms. And I try, like if I only have 15 or 20 minutes, I'll load up a side quest because I know I can finish it in that time. And if I actually manage to get all of my work done and can carve out 2 or 3 hours, then I'll try to tackle a main quest. So the nice part is a lot of games will have that built in. Even if you're playing something simple like a casual game on your phone where the rounds only last 5 or 6 minutes, and you only have 20 minutes, just tell yourself, I'm going to play 3 rounds and then set it down. So a lot of times the regulation can actually come from within the game if you just look for those small little hooks that allow you to escape after 15-minute side quests, get to a save point and get out. And if you find yourself constantly going for that 4 or 5 or 6 hour when you only wanted to spend 15 or 20 minutes, again, that's that time when you step away to kind of go, is this healthy and should I still be doing this? Or is there something else that perhaps I need to address?
This question comes from Nick, and it reads, following the failure and or poor reception of games like Anthem, Bleeding Edge, Fallout 76, and Wolfenstein Stein,
Mhm.
uh, Youngblood, do you think the current AAA development style is unsustainable? And what do you think is a possible solution to this, as it seems like all those games have an exploitative 30-second loop?
Wow.
Just a
Okay, where
simple
to
question.
start? Yeah, where to start? Um, I think games fail often for a lot of reasons. And, those are great examples of games that didn't live up to the hype. You can play the same sort of um, you can do the same thing in your mind when you talk about movies. Like imagine the last movie you saw that you thought this was terrible that you couldn't wait to see. And we're talking the same budgets. We're talking about tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. So those games can be pretty destructive to a company's bottom line. I think what we don't talk about quite as often, because there isn't the hype built around them, is how many times you download a $3 or $4 game on your phone and kind of go, well, the screenshots look great, but the game's actually terrible. I actually didn't enjoy it at all. Um, so I think that I don't think this is necessarily a AAA problem. I think what we do is we don't spend a lot of time talking about the smaller and independent games that also fail constantly. Games that will sell 100 units at $5 each and make no money for the developers. Um, are just as common, or maybe even far more common than the AAA titles. It's just that the AAA titles hit the news because there were more people waiting for them. Do I think that there's a problem in games with those failures? I don't know that I do, because I don't. Again, there are bad movies out all the time, but even a bad movie has value, and sometimes so does a bad game, because people will watch terrible movies and still get something out of it. It's kind of like cruising through Netflix, and you've seen all the great stuff, and all of a sudden you're into like the second and third tier programming, and you're like, well, this is still good. There's still value to some of those games like Anthem, even if it's just picking them apart and saying, let's not do this again. You can think about most of the major studios have had those kinds of games that they have spent a lot of money on, that didn't work out, and there's still value. And one of the things I do tell my students to do is, one of the best ways to learn how to make good games is to play the bad ones, because when you play a good game, it can be hard to pinpoint why the game is good. You can just say, well, I just like the whole thing. It was just great. It was just a great game. Like people do that all the time. Well, what did you like about it? It was just great. Um, but when you play a bad game, like you can drill down into very specific reasons why you didn't like the game. Why didn't you like that game? Well, all the cutscenes were terribly acted. Why didn't you like that game? Well, every time I pressed the jump button, it jumped 19 times and I couldn't control my character. It's weird because I don't actually want these big studios to lose tens of millions of dollars, but at the same time, we learn something about the design, the development, the marketing. We learn from those failures as well. Do I think the big studios need to make some changes? I think they do. I think they need to make changes in the way that they deal with things like crunch time. I think they need to make changes in the way they deal with stories. I think they need to make changes in the way they deal with characters and representation, um, and the way that they approach gameplay in general. But I'm not sure that any of those changes will save us from bad games. And I think those bad games are going to stick around, whether they're $10 million in development or $50 and a new laptop in development. They're going to stick around. Yeah.
So you heard it here. Bad games also have value. Oh, interesting. We have a comment from someone that says Deadly Premonition is a perfect example of an awful, nearly unplayable game that people obsess over. I'm not familiar with Deadly Premonition. Are you?
No, I'm not. But there are always games in our course when we're talking about bad games. Um, it's probably easier for me to get students to stand up and list 10 bad games than 10 great games. And it's not because there aren't 10 great games. It's because the bad games really stick right here. And they're like, I don't want to play anything like that again, and I don't want to see the developers do that again. And it's such an oddly memorable experience.
We have a question here from Max, which says, do you feel like VR is still in its infancy, and can still bounce back with games like EA's new Star Wars Squadrons, or is virtual reality a niche gimmick?
Great question. These are getting hard. I should have left after 20 minutes. Um, you know, VR is such a weird topic because 5 years ago that's all we would have talked about. The whole half an hour would have been, or the whole time we're here would have been, VR. But something happened, and I'm not sure exactly what it is. And I think you're going to get different answers if you talk to different people. I think the hardware was too expensive. I think that, it's one thing to say the PlayStation 5 is going to cost $650, but it's self contained. It's another thing to say VR is going to cost you upwards of $500, and you're going to need a $3,500 laptop to run it properly. Like even the VR that I have, I'm constantly getting a warning that the very decent laptop I had at the time is underpowered. So it's kind of off-putting. Somewhere along the way, developers probably noticed that there weren't enough headsets being sold. There weren't enough VR rigs being sold, and so the games kind of stalled. Um, so there was this really unfortunate dip in VR, and then VR almost became a non-issue again. It became something that we did and now we don't do anymore. It was like, oh God, I can't remember I think it was called a Virtual Boy, the
Yeah,
old,
the
the
Lego one,
old,
or not Lego, Nintendo one.
the Nintendo one. God, a Lego one would be amazing.
That would be amazing.
It's kind of like VR has almost gone the Virtual Boy route just over the last couple of years. Do I think Squadrons can bring it back in other games? I do. I think there's two things that has to happen. I think that the games have to start back up, and I think the hardware has to be more accessible. So things like the Oculus Quest, which is self-contained. And the problem with self-contained VR that doesn't require a laptop is it tends to be underpowered. So developers are like, well, we don't actually want to develop for an underpowered system. So, I think a handful of things has to happen. You need a more powerful headset. You need developers to come back and say, yes, we believe in this. And you need to solve some of the things like the motion sickness that affects so many people, myself included. If there is a game that doesn't have a teleport mechanic to move me around, I can only play for a few minutes. And that has to be solved, and it will. I'm 100% sure that it will. But in the meantime, I think AR, or augmented reality, is kind of catching up to virtual reality. So, it's a great question. It's one that does not have an easy answer. I don't think VR is dead. I think industry is very much keeping it alive with training applications, but I think it's going to take a little nudge from some studios to get it back at the forefront of gaming.
Awesome. We're coming up to the end of our time today, Aaron. Before we go, would you like to share any sort of final thoughts or comments with our audience today?
Oh, that's another tough question that puts me on the spot. Um, no, I think we've covered a lot of really cool stuff. I think there's a lot of great games coming out in the next few months. So depending on how much longer we're being asked to keep to our tightly knit groups and mostly in our homes, there's a lot of great games to look out for. I think there's some new consoles coming out that are going to be pretty exciting, and new technologies that are always changing. I think everybody should play games responsibly. I think that developers should develop responsibly. And I think it's still a pretty good pastime. And so, parents, play with your kids. Adults, do your thing.
Thank you so much for joining us for a Bluecoat Talk today, Aaron.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us and submitted some really great and challenging questions so that we could put Aaron on the spot. And we look forward to our next Bluecoat Talk.